Venice, the most romantic city of the world, is dying under the weight of subsidence, rising waters, and tourists. Over the last century, it has sunk 12 centimeters, leaving its foundations and the millions of wooden poles it is built on exposed to erosion and rot. For the last 30 years, engineers have planned one of the most ambitious moving dike projects in the world, dogged by indecision and scandal. Today, the MOSE, the mobile seawalls the city never needed in the past, are almost ready to be used. A new day rises over the Venice Lagoon. The water in the lagoon is between just 4 and 14 meters deep. But when the 550,000 square meters of sea surface are whipped up by adverse winds and tides, the sea level can rise by up to 2 meters, flooding the city that was built on millions of wooden stakes that hold the hundreds of sandbanks and islands together. The architectural treasure that is Venice is threatened by the very element that made it prosper in the past: water. Its position and wealth have been its ultimate downfall. With a dwindling population, the city is literally being broken down by tourism and climate change. But saving Venice has become a World Heritage priority, and billions are being spent to stop the rot. Over the last century, the once proud city of Venice has suffered the humiliation of a declining population, the invasion of new barbarians dragging trolley suitcases up and down its streets. Huge cruise liners, whose wake flattens the lagoon sea floor. And periodic flooding by the waters of the lagoon itself, as overuse of the subterranean aquifer has caused the city to subside. In adverse wind and tide conditions, the Adriatic Sea pushes into the lagoon through the 3 openings of Lido, Malamocco and Chioggia, and raises the sea level just enough to flood the streets and homes of this ancient city.
Quello che è cambiato non è ovviamente il fatto che oggi ci sono le acque.
What has changed is obviously not the fact that today we have flooding and 200 years ago we didn't, but it's the frequency that has changed, mainly due to 2 combined effects. On the one hand, we have the subsidence. The overall level of Venice and its surroundings has dropped by several centimeters, estimated at between 10 and 13 centimeters, together with the phenomenon of sea level rise, the increase in the average sea levels caused by climate change, and as a result, high and medium-high waters are more frequent during the course of the year.
Medio-alte lungo l'arco dell'anno.
La progettazione di per sé ha molti aspetti di.
The design has in itself several important, difficult aspects. The resistance of the structure overall with respect to the loads, and the many systems including rotating the legs, and transport. They were certainly not easy to develop, but they were the most fun.
Certamente facili da sviluppare, però sono stati anche quelli più divertenti.
The so-called acqua alta is a phenomenon that occurs mainly in the winter months, when high tides in the Adriatic Sea coincide with winds that blow towards Venice, creating a flood wave that invades the navigation channels and spreads over the lagoon until it reaches the city itself. Some tourists may find the flooding of St. Mark's Square fun, but the heart of the most romantic city in the world is also the lowest point of Venice, and the flooding causes inestimable damage to the foundations of St. Mark's Cathedral, one of the most ancient in Italy. Once the water rises above the level of the special marble used by the engineers who built the city over the centuries to provide insulation of the brickwork, then the facades of the buildings begin to suffer dramatic erosion. These buildings are designed to be light, as they stand on millions of wooden piles, so any damage to the brickwork can cause structural damage too. The high waters are eroding not just the foundations of the city, but some of the world's most beautiful works of architecture. The lagoon is an ecosystem in danger. Not only the city, but the hundreds of islands and wetlands that make up this unique landscape risk being lost forever, with the added complication of rising sea levels. Bounded in the north by the river Sile and in the south by Brenta, for centuries the Venetians fought a battle to stop the lagoons silting up, even deviating the course of inland rivers. Access to the sea was Venice's source of power, and the lagoon was its natural defense. In the last 30 years, the situation has been reversed. Trade now goes to Marghera, the city that drained the water table, and the sea has become a threat. The walls of Venice are the massive floating barriers that will stop the sea from flooding Venice. Giovanni Zarotti is the lead engineer on the MOSE project. He has seen it grow over the years and now heads up the team that will bring it to fruition. The new Venice consortium of Venetian enterprises that has come together to build the MOSE, or Modulo Sperimentale Elettromeccanico, the floating walls that will defend Venice from high waters.
Il MOSE è un'opera che prende avvio dopo gli eventi del 66.
MOSE is a project that began after the events of 1966, with the exceptionally high tide that caused flooding of huge parts of Venice and the massive damage done to the city's cultural and monumental heritage. As a result, there was a significant intervention with the creation of an infrastructure to control the medium-high tides. That means tides that reach 1.10 meters above the average sea level and can go as high as 1.96 meters, as happened in 1966.
Moving the massive engineering parts that make up the MOSE fell to one of the world's leading heavy lift companies, Fagioli. In 2012, the company was engaged by the new Venice consortium to lay the floating barriers and concrete housings that cross the Lido entrance to the lagoon. It was the beginning of the final phase of the MOSE project. However, the Malamocco and Chioggia entrances required extra engineering, as they are even deeper and wider than the Lido entrance. Fagioli's engineer, Tommaso Favaretto, was the lead engineer on the project.
Sono state costruite rispetto al progetto precedente degli elementi sia orizzontali.
As compared to the previous operation, we added horizontal elements, crosshead beams. We lengthened them to allow us to cover the geometric parameters of the walls of Chioggia and Malamocco. They weigh more and are larger than the Lido Tre Porti walls. Here we're talking about 400 to 450 tons of weight to move over several tens of meters.
Su una lunghezza di diverse decine di metri.
The MOSE is one of the largest works of civil engineering built in Italy. Over the last 10 years, it has provided hope that the city can be saved from sinking under the waves. The world waits with bated breath to see if the walls of Venice will actually save the city. The project is one of the most complex works of civil engineering ever built in Italy, designed to save the city from the periodic flooding.
Le opere sono ufficialmente state avviate nel 2003.
The project was officially launched in 2003, and a lot of the work, most of which has already been finished, were works of civil engineering. So, for example, the concrete housings that form the base of the work, and the housing for the walls, consolidation work, and the essential infrastructures that the whole project needs that are located at the lagoon entrances.
The Venice Lagoon is 80% made up of wetlands that are partially submerged, and only 12% is made up of islands, while the city of Venice is actually held together by millions of wooden piles pushed into the mud and sand. The tides that so threaten the city are also its only real drainage system. Twice a day, clean water enters the canals and dirty water is taken away. As a result, there were several prerequisites for the MOSE that the designers undertook to respect, not only to maintain the overall visual aspect of the lagoon, but also to ensure free exchange of water between it and the open sea.
Conseguentemente si è avviata tutta una fase progettuale.
So we began the planning process, but the Italian government set a certain number of prerequisites for the construction process, and there are two main ones: that the construction should have a low visual impact and should not modify greatly the overall aspect of the lagoon. And the second was that it should not substantially change the hydrodynamic exchange between the open sea and the lagoon.
Later, the plan involved restoring the natural ecosystem that contributed in the past to slowing down the flooding process. Access for ships and seawater into the Venice Lagoon is through 3 openings in the long sandbank that makes up the barrier with the open sea. The openings are at the Lido of Venice, at the small fishing village of Malamocco, and in the south of the lagoon at Chioggia. The MOSE concept is based on a system of floating barriers to close these 3 openings when the adverse wind and sea conditions are forecast. They are massive steel walls that can be filled with compressed air when necessary, rising to the surface, making a floating wall.
Quando si entra nella fase operativa, il meccanismo principale è quello che vede la...
When the system becomes operational, the main process involves air being pressurized, that is, then pumped through pipes into the barriers. When the pumping begins, the barrier that is usually filled with water, because it has openings that ensure it is filled with seawater, is filled with air that pushes the water out of the same openings. And through the simple floating process, the barrier is subject to the Archimedes effect and rotates upwards and emerges above the sea surface.
La paratoia subisce la spinta di Archimede, ruota ed emerge rispetto al pelo libero dell'acqua.
The floating barriers lie flat on top of huge underwater bunkers, with access tunnels that allow for maintenance, where the massive hinges around which the barriers rotate are housed. The mobile walls are built to fit snugly on the sea floor, and once floating one beside the other, create a watertight wall of steel. In 2013, the first mobile walls were installed at the Lido entrance to the lagoon. This entrance was so wide that it was artificially divided into 2 to allow easier management of the massive structures. In these extraordinary images, dating back to the first campaign to lay the caissons, the concrete housings for the barriers, we see the area where the housings were built being flooded. One by one, the caissons were pumped with air and floated. Fagioli used a special catamaran to position each 12,000-ton concrete housing over the 12-meter deep trench dug into the sea floor, where 4 300-ton capacity strand jacks lowered it onto bags that were slowly emptied to provide the soft landing needed for absolute precision. The exact location of each caisson was guaranteed using GPS positioning and radar. It was one of the most complex moves Fagioli had ever carried out.
The housings were prefabricated in an area that was drained of seawater. So they were built on the bottom of the sea, and they are cellular housings, so made of concrete walls, but partially empty inside, so able to float.
Ma parzialmente vuoti all'interno, per cui in grado di galleggiare.
So in this case, at San Nicolò and Chioggia, they were built on land that had been reclaimed from the sea that was flooded, and they were floated.
In qualche maniera sottratta al mare e portati in galleggiamento.
Then the walls themselves were laid. They weighed 210 tons. They were floated out to the location above their concrete housings on a barge, and then lifted by a specially designed gantry crane and lowered into place so that they fit perfectly onto the hinges. In a rare visit to the underwater bunkers, located more than a dozen meters under the surface of the lagoon, the actual configuration of the concrete housings for the mobile barriers can be seen. A tunnel with lifts at each end allows for regular inspection of the hydraulics and electric systems that are at the heart of the MOSE. Each hinge is housed in its own room with watertight access doors. A reserve tunnel ensures there is access under all conditions, even when the bunker-like construction is flooded. Malamocco is a pleasant fishing village on the strand that separates the Adriatic Sea from the Venice Lagoon, and is also the place where hundreds of ships pass through every year to get to Porto Marghera, the great industrial and petrochemical hub of northern Italy. The channel is particularly deep, and the caissons, or bunkers, were built close by as they were particularly heavy. While at Lido, each of the caissons is able to house 2 barriers, here each concrete underwater bunker houses 3.
At Malamocco, the system we used was different, although the housings were essentially the same. They were built on a bank built above sea level and then moved via a system of rollers and taken to the synchrolift, which is a kind of massive elevator that lowered them into the sea, and then they were floated away and tugged to their final destination, and then they were sunk again.
Con dei rimorchiatori fino alla zona di varo e lì nuovamente affondati.
Building such a huge work of civil engineering was easier said than done. The concrete structures built at Malamocco first had to be lifted and then moved onto the huge synchrolift crane. Then they were lowered into the water to be tugged out to the open sea and dragged to the place where they were to be sunk. The sea floor had to be specially prepared to house them, so that their roofs were flush with the natural depth of the sea in those locations. Then they had to be emptied to allow access to workers to prepare the electrical wiring and compressed air pipes that activate the enormous floating walls.
The size of the housings varies from one lagoon entry to another, but the largest are 60 meters long, 40 meters wide, and 12 meters high, and the whole of the height has been encased level with the seafloor. Weights differ too, but we are in the area of 22,000 tons of concrete. The barriers have a very important element, that is, the hinge that allows them to rotate and also receive all the surface piping that carries air, that make them rotate and float. So there are corridors that allow them to run through the housings.
E quindi c'è la necessità di poterli percorrere questi cassoni.
The depth of the lagoon entrances at Chioggia and Malamocco required significant modifications to the original gantry crane that was used in 2013.
Il canale di Malamocco ha peraltro una...
The Malamocco entrance has an extra difficulty that was dealt with during the planning phase and in the construction phase. That we had to guarantee the continued passage of cargo ships going to Porto Marghera, the industrial area of Venice. In this case, the seafloor is deeper, as I said, 14 meters deep. So, as a result, the barriers are the longest, because as they rotate and float, they have to push a greater volume of water, so they are almost 30 meters long, 29 meters and 3 centimeters.
E quindi arrivano a sfiorare i 30 metri, 29 centimetri per la precisione.
Non esisteva un'attrezzatura adatta all'installazione della paratoia per...
There was no pre-existing tool to install these barriers due to the geometry and the dimensions of the barrier, as well as due to the location they were laid in.
È quello della laguna di Venezia, per cui ci si trova di fatto in mezzo all'acqua.
We were working in the Venice Lagoon, so over water, so we needed a gantry crane to lower these barriers onto their housings.
Di carro ponte per calare le paratoie in posizione di installazione.
During the whole time, ships continued to enter and exit the lagoon along the deep channel carved into the lagoon floor to allow tankers and cargo ships to reach Porto Marghera, one of Italy's great industrial cities. It is close to Venice, and the wake of the ships contributes to flattening the lagoon floor, which in turn speeds up the flow of floodwater. To combat this, the New Venice Consortium is rebuilding a system of islands and wetlands that are designed to not only slow the floodwaters, but also to encourage the return of wildlife.
Nell'ambito appunto degli interventi promossi
Among the projects promoted by the state, by the Commission for Public Works and former Inland Waters Office, or Magistrato delle Acque, and taken forward by the consortium, also involved the reconstruction of the wetlands, areas of land that are covered by water during high tides, but emerge at low tide, that are home to unique flora and fauna. Apart from preserving habitats, these areas also make the hydrodynamics inside the lagoon more efficient.
Più efficace l'idrodinamica interna della laguna.
Here at the Fagioli headquarters near Reggio Emilia in northern Italy, engineers are working on the technical specifications of a gantry crane that is soon to be handed over to the New Venice Consortium to allow the regular maintenance of the floating barriers that have become Venice's new walls.
La cavalletta ha un ingombro in pianta di circa 50 metri per 25 metri.
The gantry crane is about 50 meters long and 25 meters wide, and it's about 35 and 36 meters tall.
Le gambe sono costituite da delle torri tralicciate e da dei tubi circolari.
With regards to the legs are made up of a trellis tower, which is built from tubular steel, and it's 26 meters tall, held together by top frame beams, on which the long beams are placed, and these hold the strand jacks and the fishing beam.
Per sorreggono I nostri martinetti e di conseguenza la trave pescatrice.
The Fagioli engineers, however, had other concerns. Their new gantry crane had to be tall enough to reach the deeper caissons of the Malamocco and Chioggia openings, some 14 meters deep, and at the same time be small enough to be safe and stable on the barge.
I fondali di Chioggia di Malamocco sono più alti.
The openings of Chioggia and Malamocco are deeper. Malamocco, which is the deepest, is 14 meters deep, between the surface and the top of the housings.
È necessario anche alzarla in altezza.
So we needed to make the crane taller, adding several meters of leg length. So compared with the previous 9 meters, we had to add 6 more meters of trellis tower.
6 metri di tronchi di gambe in più, di torri tralicciate in più.
An engineering complication made their lives even more difficult. This gantry crane was built especially to lay the 58 walls that make up the barriers at Malamocco and Chioggia. The massive trellis structure had to be able to lift the larger floating barriers that weighed more than 400 tons and were wider than the Lido barriers. The calculation of the forces applied to the different parts of crane had to be precise, especially because the crane had one potentially weak point.
È stata costruita una struttura che si chiama...
We built a structure called a mid-head frame, a rotating frame that's located halfway down the legs, which allows the legs to be rotated, gull-wing-like, reducing the vertical height of the gantry crane. This allows it to be transported from the assembly yard all the way to the location where the barriers are to be laid.
alla posizione di montaggio delle paratoie.
The special tool that the Fagioli engineers have at their disposal is the strand jack, the hydraulic jack that is able to slowly lift hundreds of tons of weight, using a concept that is simple in itself but highly complex to build. A strand jack is a hollow hydraulic cylinder with a set of steel cables, the strands passing through the open center, each one passing through 2 clamps, one mounted to either end of the cylinder. The jack operates in the manner of a caterpillar's walk, climbing or descending along the strands by releasing the clamp at one end, expanding the cylinder, clamping there, releasing the trailing end, contracting and clamping the trailing end before starting over again. The real significance of this device lies in the facility for precision control. When many strand jacks are activated at the same time under the control of a central computer system, the lifting power of each individual steel strand can be multiplied infinitely. Fagioli famously supplied the near 100 strand jacks that rolled the Costa Concordia onto the artificial seafloor so that it could be readied for refloat.
Tutti I martinetti rispondono ad un medesimo cervello elettronico.
All the strand jacks respond to the same central computer that's controlled by an operator, and the combination of the operator's skill and the capacity of the software allows full control of movement and loads, so as to guarantee that the whole operation sits within the project parameters and the requirements of the object being lifted, that is often very delicate, so needs very fine lifting tolerances, high precision, and above all, need to respect safety limits.
E soprattutto rispetto della sicurezza.
Fagioli designs its own strand jacks, and on this entirely new gantry crane, the sets of strand jacks did different jobs. The folding legs needed 4 strand jacks each to open and close the joints.
La cavalletta di varo, gantry crane, è equipaggiato con 4 martinetti di sollevamento.
The gantry crane is equipped with 4 main strand jacks, able to lift 300 tons, the AL300s. The transport beam is equipped with as many AL300s, and the crane also carries another 8 50-ton capacity strand jacks to enable the rotation of the legs. And these are used to rotate the legs one way, to open them, 4 are needed for this, and 4 are needed to close them.
E 4 per la chiusura.
The logistics of getting the gantry crane to Venice were so difficult that the company decided to build it directly close by. All the parts were manufactured and delivered to a construction site at Porto Marghera.
E la cavalletta viene...
The gantry crane is assembled and built at a site near the place of operation, but not on it. The place was ex-Area Bagnan.
Si chiama Area Pagnan, ex-Area Pagnan.
It was built here, first building the individual parts, and then putting them all together with the legs closed, so rotated upwards.
Viene assemblato tutto l'assieme con gambe ruotate, quindi con le gambe rivolte verso l'alto.
Getting the gantry crane onto the barge was a specially difficult task. Luckily, Fagioli also owns hundreds of SPMTs, self-propelled motorized transports, that not only are modular, so can be as long or as short as needed, but can also lift their loads. Fagioli uses SPMTs in all their heavy lift operations. SPMTs are modular, wheeled flatbed vehicles that are remotely driven and maneuvered. They are able to move in any direction and even rotate, as each set of wheels is independent. They can be as long or as short as the user wants, as well as hydraulically raising their load. They are seen here moving the whole center section of a ship that has been lengthened by slipping this new segment into the middle. The versatility of the SPMTs is shown by how the wheels swivel 90 degrees to move the load perpendicularly to the original direction of transport.
La cavalletta è circa 800 tonnellate.
The gantry crane weighs 800 tons, so moving 800 tons together with a transport beam was not easy, because the center of gravity is very high.
Il baricentro è molto in alto.
So stability had to be guaranteed at every stage, both during transport and during operations.
To move the gantry crane to lay the MOSE barriers, they were slid under it and lifted it. Slowly but surely, they drove onto the barge that was specially ballasted to maintain stability until the weight of the crane was central. It could now be taken to the construction site closer to where the floating barriers were to be laid. A special transport beam was loaded with it, so that once on site, it could be raised and lowered as needed.
Una volta che è assemblata, come tanti pezzi del Lego.
Once the gantry crane was built and put together like so many Lego bricks, it was transported using another system built by Fagioli, called the transport beam. And it was loaded onto the barge using self-propelled transports, and then taken to the worksite, where it was prepared for the installations.
Dove viene preparata per l'installazione.
Now came the delicate moment of actually taking the crane to the location of the massive concrete caisson.
Alla banchina di cantiere viene sbarcata.
Once we reached the worksite, the crane was disembarked and turned 90 degrees into the installation position. Then it was re-embarked in the installation position and then taken to the point above the concrete housing where the first barrier, or the barrier in question, was to be lowered and then set up.
E lì viene posata.
The barge made its way to the pre-established site over the caisson hinge where the floating barrier was to be placed. It was then held in place by cables attached to posts, and the barge's pilot's job was now to keep it stably in the same place, using a joystick that pulled on the cables to counter any current or wind.
La chiatta con a bordo la cavalletta viene ormeggiata mediante degli argani.
The barge with the gantry crane on board was then anchored using cables attached to winches, and the cables were attached to foundation poles located at the lagoon entrances. And the positioning of the barge was managed using a positioning software based on GPS and regulated by pulling on the cables by winches until the gantry crane was in the correct position for the barrier to be laid over the housing.
In posizione nella posizione corretta per essere calata dalla chiatta fin sul cassone.
This time, the legs had to protrude over the side of the barge so that they could be unfolded and lowered into place. Neoprene pads had been attached to the bottom of the legs so as not to damage the concrete surface of the caissons. The strandjacks pulled open the legs, which were then locked to provide maximum stability. The lifting device lowered the gantry crane onto the surface of the caisson.
La cavalletta nei suoi piedi, nel base frame, ha
The gantry crane was equipped with a centering cone located in the base of the frame, which is a male part that's wedged into the receptacle on the surface of the concrete housing. Once in position, the gantry crane is lowered until the male cone, that's on the foot of the crane, enters into the receiving cone located on the housing surface.
Entra nell'alloggiamento del cassone di soglia.
The barge was withdrawn and went to collect the huge yellow floating barrier that had to be placed on the underwater hinge. The fishing beam was lowered by 4 300-ton capacity strandjacks, and once the barrier was safely attached using electrically operated couplings, it was raised, and once again the barge could slip away, leaving only air and water between the barrier and its place of final location.
Quindi la paratoia viene agganciata alla trave pescatrice, che è agganciata alla cavalletta di varo mediante gli strandjack.
So the barrier is attached to the fishing beam that's attached to the gantry crane via strandjacks that allow vertical movement. The fishing beam is equipped with hydraulic systems that push against the gantry crane to allow for horizontal movement, so we get millimetric positioning both vertically and horizontally.
Impianta e verticale che ha precisione quasi millimetrica.
Slowly but surely, the fishing beam lowered the floating barrier 14 meters underwater until the male part of the hinge fitted snugly into the female receptacle where it could be fixed. The fishing beam could be withdrawn once again. However, the whole operation involved laying floating barriers in as little time as possible. So as soon as the first was fixed in place, the transportation beam was brought out on the barge, and once again, the gantry crane was lifted out of the water. The strandjacks pulled up the legs, and once again the barge was tugged to the next position. Laying the MOSE floating barriers took months, in every kind of weather that the Venice Lagoon could throw at the equipment and the men.
In all, there are 78 barriers, but more were actually built because there are 2 spare barriers for every lagoon entry. And the reason for this is that these barriers will have a periodic need for maintenance. So, in order not to leave the place where the barrier has been removed without, while it is being repaired, the extra and identical barrier is positioned there as soon as the barrier due for maintenance is removed.
Diciamo che le condizioni di progetto per le macchine sono
Let's say that the operating conditions for the machines were very severe and were respected. During operations, the humidity, the rain, the cold of winter still exist, and people who work on site get sun when it's sun and rain when it's rain.
Prende il sole quando c'è il sole e è esposto alla pioggia quando c'è la pioggia.
Each operation required up to 15 workers to maneuver the massive gantry crane that Fagioli had specially built to do the job. Worker safety was one of the chief priorities of the company. As the seasons came and went, the floating barriers of Chioggia and Malamocco were securely laid, and the great civil engineering project approached completion. The next steps involved testing it.
Le paratoie del sistema MOSE sono in realtà.
The MOSE floating barriers are already operation in experimental mode at Tre Porti. to check they work and in order to set activation parameters. Here, all 20 barriers have been laid, and they have been raised several times, and so the entrance closed several times.
Di sollevamenti e quindi di chiusure della bocca di porto.
Although billions of euros have been spent on the MOSE project, it will only be activated under certain specific conditions. Conditions that threaten the whole of the city, rather than just the area of Rialto and St. Mark's Square, the lowest points, which will continue to be flooded even during relatively low high tides. The buildings of Venice are light, with as much as half of their outer walls open with windows. Rotting brickwork and wood severely undermine the structural integrity of the palaces and churches of this once thriving city.
A metà del 2020,
Around 2020, we expect the whole project to be finished, with the support plant working, so fully operational, and with MOSE available to protect Venice from high tides. By the end of 2021, we will have finished the ancillary work, more to do with the environment and architecture, that do not influence the operation of the whole project.
architettonica, che però non influiscono sulla funzionalità dell'opera.
Although the MOSE project is only dedicated to isolating the lagoon from the Adriatic Sea in adverse weather conditions, saving this unique city from oblivion has been costly.
Possiamo dire che il MOSE
We can say that the MOSE, once it is finished, will have cost in the area of 5 billion euros. This should be compared with Venice's cultural and monumental value, which I think is priceless.
storico-monumentali di Venezia, che credo abbia un valore inestimabile.
The most iconic cathedral square in the world has now also been included in the overall plan to save Venice. This cathedral is unique, with its Byzantine mosaics and amazing crypt. Every high tide floods it and destroys more of this 1,000-year-old brickwork.
Vicino alla Basilica di San Marco,
Close to St. Mark's Cathedral, we have a value of 70 centimeters above sea level. So even with 70-centimeter tides, due to the many tunnels under St. Mark's that were built to drain rainwater from the square, the inverse flow of the tide runs up these tunnels and begins to flood the square. So the committee and the consortium are working on a plan to insert anti-reflux valves against the tide, allowing the draining of rainwater, but stopping reverse flow of high tides.
il ritorno d'acqua dell'alta marea.
Today, with the MOSE nearly completed, one of the many threats to the very survival of Venice has almost been removed. There are many others. But as the sun sets over the most beautiful city in the world, Venetians hope that the tide has turned.